was announced that Sam Pittman would be retained for his 6th season, it got me thinking this kind of back and forth between whether or not it's justified to keep him. Because I did a video last month saying that it was justified to keep him, primarily because of Arkansas beating Tennessee. But as I've been watching Arkansas the past couple weeks, it's made me second guess myself in terms of that. Because if you go on Reddit and look at what the Arkansas fans are saying, needless to say that they're pretty pissed off for a number of reasons. But you go back and you look at the history of Arkansas head coach, and you say, who can't forget Houston Nutt from '98 to 2007. Then you go with Bobby Petrino. Then you had Brett Bielema, who just kind of struggled there, but now is finding his groove at Illinois. You have Chad Morris, who struggled mightily from 2017 to 2019. And then here's Sam Pittman. Now, there's some pros and cons to both, obviously. But in terms of keeping the longevity and the culture, it does make a lot of sense to keep Sam Pittman in that regard. Because say what you want about Sam Pittman, but one of the things I love about Sam Pittman is he's a really relatable guy. I mean, he comes off as blue collar, as humbling, and also, quite frankly, he's freaking hilarious too, especially some of the shit that he says in his press game conferences too. And he's a straight shooter. I mean, he tells it like it is, whether he likes it or not. And even in my little quote right there, talking about his thoughts, it's like, hey, like, dude, you're messing up my recruiting every time you ask me this question. And even for Arkansas's AD to have to announce that he's coming back already kind of says enough in terms of whether or not they should keep him in that regard. Because I always say to myself as a fan, if I have to sit there and have your athletic director announce that you're coming back, it gives you a pause for concern, right? Because I mean, you could even talk about UAB and Trent Dilfer, and it was the same sort of thing where they pretty much had to announce, like, hey, sorry, we're going to keep him for another season. We see the hope, the praise, whatever you want to call it. But looking at this full circle, I think it's best to talk about the reasons to keep him and reasons not to keep him, and kind of go from there. In terms of reasons to keep him, now, obviously, financially speaking, that's always one of the biggest reasons, especially in college football now, right? If Arkansas were to fire Sam Pittman right after the Missouri game, that would have cost them $12.14 million or something like that, which is a pretty substantial number. That's definitely more than what Purdue just paid to fire Ryan Walters. Obviously, it's not as much as Jimbo or Brian Hartson or anybody like that, but it's still a good chunk of money too. And in terms of the financial angle, a lot of people will have the argument of, well, you just paid John Calipari to go from Kentucky to Arkansas. You paid him a shitload of money. Why can't we use those resources from basketball to football? And one of the arguments, obviously, is regardless of how you dice it, football has never been the primary sport for Arkansas in general. It's always been basketball and baseball, and then football is kind of that number 3 too, because ever since those days of Houston not Bobby Petrino, fans have been kind of just waiting for that coach, waiting for that specific player to kind of light up the fan base too. But even what's been fascinating about Arkansas in general too is their fan attendance has actually gone up 6% this year, which is something I wouldn't have anticipated too. So it's not like Arkansas fans aren't coming to the games. It's not like they don't care anymore. It's the biggest question you ask yourself is, hey, you'd be on the hook for that much. You'd be on the hook for that much money. And you have to ask yourself too, do you really want to clean house and get rid of everybody too? Because I think for one argument, I don't think it's that clear that they would just go ahead and hire Bobby Petrino, because since they're a state school, there could be some issues with them hiring Petrino going forward from there because of all the incidences that he had with the motorcycle crash. I don't know if there's any legal ramifications regarding that, but that could possibly be an issue too. But let's say if you fired Pittman and you said, okay, I don't want to keep Petrino, where do you go from there? So to me, that's one of those arguments where I say to myself, a lot of fans that I tend to see in the college football world will advocate for somebody to get fired or advocate that somebody's an idiot or this, that, or the other, but you don't give a good suggestion in terms of who they should hire. And to me, Arkansas is not the type of program where you go out and get, like, to me, like a John Summerall or Jeff Monken, in my opinion. That wouldn't be good enough for me if I'm firing Sam Pittman. Yes, he's gone 23-31. Yes, he struggled in one possession games. But at the same time, the one thing you can say, regardless of all those things, is he is a phenomenal recruiter. Even it was just announced today that Nico's little brother, Madden, actually just flipped from UCLA to Arkansas. So that's going to be another 4-star quarterback coming in, and on top of the 5-star quarterback that's coming in as well. So you have Taylen Green competing against these two guys too, which makes you kind of wonder, yes, Taylen Green definitely is a good enough quarterback. I think they can fix him to some extent too, because he does have a lot of athletic ability. He does have a cannon for an arm. He is athletic enough to extend plays. However, it's those turnovers, and also the offensive line has been utter shit for him too, which is supposed to be Sam Pittman's specialty, but we haven't seen an offensive line from them in the past 2 seasons. So it kind of makes you sit there and wonder, okay, does it make more sense to double down on Taylen Green, get him some more weapons, and pay more in NIL? Or do you completely scratch that, let Taylen Green transfer, and just have it be sort of a quarterback battle going into spring training? And I think that's where really Sam Pittman and Bobby Petrino are going to have to ask themselves. And that's really going to be the legacy in terms of how this all kind of shapes out too. Because if you're Arkansas, I would definitely argue, yes, they need to spend more money in the NIL. And the reality is that they're going to get, until they take that next step and pay more for some of these players that are coming in, they're always going to end up with these, 3 to 4-star players who are good players and will add depth to your roster, but not those great elite players that are going to be the difference between going 6 wins to possibly 9 or 10. Because one of the arguments in terms of not keeping him, for example, is I ask myself, is Sam Pittman's ceiling really only 6 wins? And being objective, I think there's a fair argument that says that. Because let's say Arkansas doesn't spend the money in the NIL that they need. They don't get the wide receiver help that they desperately need. I think that's one thing. If you ask me what they need, they got to get some wide receiver help in there. I don't know what they're doing in terms of the offensive line. Obviously, Sam Pittman fired Dan Enos. He brought in Petrino. That's great. But at the same time, you have to ask yourself, is it the play calling that's screwed up? Is it Taylen Green making mistakes? Is it not having an offensive line? To me, it seems like a mix of everything too, because what I will say is the rushing attack has came alive a little bit more over these past couple weeks. However, you ask yourself too, have we seen enough progression for you to justify keeping Sam Pittman for another year too? And just for some context in terms of coaches, I just want to rattle off the records of past Arkansas coaches. So before I'm excluding interim coaches here, by the way. So Sam Morris, 4-18, 2017 to 2019. Brett Bielema, 29-30-33 from 2013 to 2017. Bobby Petrino, 34-17, 2008, 2011. And then Houston Nutt, 75-48 from 98 to 2007. So it makes me sit there and say to myself, okay, there's been no consistency in terms of keeping head coaches. I think Sam Pittman really does fit the culture in terms of what Arkansas is trying to do, which is tough physical football, having having some character. I think that's one thing I love about watching Arkansas football is they got character, they got a swagger to them, and I think Sam Pittman is a great face for the program. But you ask yourself too, he's turning 63 in a couple days. So in terms of the longevity of the program, maybe he's sitting there thinking to himself, hey, I just want to sit there and crush some beers in a couple years instead of sitting there and recruiting kids to come to Fayetteville and trying to convince kids not to jump in the transfer portal. Because I mean, hey, I totally understand if you would rather sit there and crush a Bud Light instead of hammering kids down to try to come back too. Because you even see this trend in college football in general, where a lot of a lot of head coaches are starting to say to themselves, instead of being a Group 5 coach and working my way up that way, I would rather just be a coordinator at a bigger school and then I can always flip and become a head coach in a different way too, whether it's the head coach gets fired or I just find another better opportunity or whatever it is. But still, when you sit there and say to yourself too that Arkansas finished 113th in sacks allowed this year, they gave up 2.91 sacks this year. So it makes me also pause to the extent of, you say to yourself, man, Sam Pittman would be a phenomenal offensive line coach for any SEC school or really any school in the country. However, when you see the way the offensive line has played the past couple years, I'm sorry, but this is not all on Taylen Green and Bobby Petrino. I think there are obviously some flaws there that you can certainly point out. However, there are a lot of elements that are coming into play that isn't as simple as, okay, just fire Bobby Petrino, just fire Sam Pittman, pay him his $12 million, and everything's going to be all good from there. I think there's a lot of more bigger issues that are at play here. And when you ask me, sitting there saying whether or not Sam Pittman should be retained, right now I still lean more towards yes, because I would say on the football field, there are a lot of reservations, just as I listed out. However, when you look at this full picture and you look at the buyout and you look who's out there comparative to what other jobs are really available, right now the best job out there is North Carolina. So even because at the same time, just like North Carolina and Purdue, you have a lot of similar struggles a lot of similar challenges there that you would at Arkansas. So that's kind of the catch-21 that you have. Yes, you play in the SEC, but you also play against Georgia, Texas, Kentucky, Florida, Georgia, all pretty much. You have one of the toughest schedules every single year. So for you to combat that, be relatively competitive, and look halfway decent, I mean, it's not completely awful too. I mean, they're going to make a bowl game this year, being 6-6, but you have to ask yourself too, going 6-16 in one score games, when is enough going to be enough? But in terms of right here, right now, I am still of the belief, just as I was last month, that Sam Pittman ultimately should be the head coach going into this season, mainly because of the buyout, because of his recruiting ability, and because it makes sense in terms of the longevity of the program.